Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Texas Longhorns Orange Bloods football YouTube channel. I'm Ari Temkin along with Geoff Ketchum. What's up? What's up, Ketch? How are you, buddy?
I'm good. It's nice to sometimes just ride shotgun on these. Like I don't have to be responsible for anything other than being clever at some point. So go.
That's right.
My first, you caught me off guard. But yes, that was what was really going through my head right now is it's nice to not have to remind people to, subscribe to the channel or like the video or comment in the comments section to let us know what you think about what we're about to talk about and or clicking the notifications button so that you get all of the notifications when we release video content, which is every day.
Boom. See, you didn't even have to do it, but you did it because you're the best.
I know, but I was just thinking about how cool it would be now that I don't have to in this video.
So, Ketch, obviously there's a lot that's gone wrong with Texas this season on the football field. I wonder, in your estimation, how much of it is on Sark? A coach gets a certain amount of leeway, certainly at the collegiate level, certainly in year one. How do we evaluate a coach year one? How do we evaluate Sark year one? What are the legitimate evaluations? What are the legitimate ways in which we can evaluate him and his coaching? And if this is working year one?
Well, I tend to think of it even a little bit more removed from the football field than that, right? Because you have to take into consideration recruiting and roster building.
Development.
Yeah. I mean, there are, media relations and alumni relations when it comes to the head coaching position at a major university like Texas. There are a lot of different tiers to the job responsibility. And I think, look, as would be the case with anybody, there are some that he's doing, I think, a really good job with. I think managing the portal is a completely new thing that we'll start judging coaches on that probably wasn't even on the radar completely the day he was hired. I mean, people knew that the portal existed, but they hadn't yet gone through a year when they'd seen schools go shopping in it. Like the thought was, oh, well, these guys will all just be scrubs. And then it's like, well, Michigan State took 20 and it's working for them. And Alabama's best player on offense and defense might have come through the portal. And it's like, oh, so we really have to change the way we think about just that one thing. I think that when I look at Sark at its most broadest standpoint, the expectations were an elite first-year recruiting class. Because generally speaking, all new coaches at Texas and Texas A&M get to go through a honeymoon class. I mean, Charlie had one and Tom had one and Matt Brown had the number one recruiting class in the country way back in the day. And we've seen Texas A&M coaches be able to do the same thing. A first-year coach at either of those two schools typically signs a top 5 type recruiting class. So that's one area. And I think on the field, the idea was that Texas was already pretty good under Tom Herman, that they'd been borderline top 20. They finished 19th last year. They finished 25 the year before. They're hovering in this pretty good, but certainly not elite, and maybe not even quite a step away from elite. Like they're just pretty good. And I think the thought process was that Steve Sarkisian, being a better offensive mind, elevates the head coaching position to a place of maybe better than pretty good. But I think the idea was, even with the changes in the roster, we'd be looking at a program that would probably be similarly to the most recent Texas teams, a top 25 type team. And if it was a really, really good year, then you climb up that ladder. And, right now, this is a Texas football team that is 4-4 by really narrow margins. I mean, they'd be top 10 in the country if football was 3 quarters. If football was a 45-minute game, Texas is talking about where they're positioned on the playoff announcements on Tuesday, right?
Yeah.
Instead, it's a 60-minute game, and we're talking about bowl eligibility. And, this team's good enough to have been 7-1 if games lasted 45 minutes, but poor enough that it can be 4-4 through 60-minute games, 8 games through the schedule. It's a tough one to get a handle on. It's clearly not good enough. The question is, if we're giving an A, B, C, D, F grade, like what does it look like there? And what are, I think, specifically the areas where they've been really good and the areas where they can do better. And, it's a varied conversation with a lot of different things to talk about. But on the outset, the goal was top 5 recruiting class, which they could still pull off. I mean, as it stands, they're in that territory. The season on the field stuff, this isn't going as good. It's going to be a disappointment no matter how it finishes now. And, is it a catastrophic disappointment? Too soon to know. As it stands right now, though, I just think the thing that everybody can agree on is it's just not quite good enough. How much of that is on his shoulders, I think, is up for debate. But I mean, for me, everybody owns a piece of the responsibility. Certainly the coaching staff, certainly the head coach.
When a program flounders, and you hear this a lot too with the Cowboys, where and the Cowboys aren't obviously losing this year, they're doing very well, and this could be the best season they've had in 25 years. But over the last 25 years, as they've failed, there becomes these large indictments on Jerry and program building. So that's what happens, I think, with organizations, whatever level. When you start to lose, and it's been sort of sustained losing relative to expectations over an extended period of time, it starts to become this like overarching indictment on things. And so I go back to a decade ago when you and I worked together at 104.9 The Horn, and it was the beginning of the end of Mac Brown. And there was this feeling of entitlement amongst the Texas football players. Like they had achieved a certain level once they put that Texas jersey on that they had not attained. They weren't Vince Young, they weren't Michael Griffith. They weren't any of these guys that had been the mountaintop, and yet
they've been treated like gods,
and they had, right. And
ridden the coattails of actual gods, right? Like,
so Mac's tenure ends eventually. Charlie comes in. We don't have to, go through all this, but it sort of feels like we're having the same discussions. And so,
see, I don't quite feel that way.
Okay.
Like I agree with you about where this thing started. I think there's just, there's probably some entitlement issues that exist in the sense that there's a conversation to be had about Texas high school talent and how it gets developed, and how, there are a lot of coaches across the country that believe that Texas athletes in high school receive so much coaching and have so much of a facility advantage and a weight room advantage, and that they just have advantages to them in their early development that allow for them to maybe become coddled, to maybe, there's a lot of things that are involved in that. So I think there's probably some that exist with this Texas roster, but I don't look at this roster and think to myself, these players are entitled, because I think there's genuinely a thirst. I can feel it from these athletes that they want to take the next step and get better. And I don't think they're coasting, but I think that all of the pieces in a number of different areas aren't in place. And it's keeping this group from completely getting off the ground. This must have been what the Wright brothers looked like when they're trying to get that first airplane off the ground. And it's like, I think are they going to do it? They're going to do it. And then it's like, oh, well, maybe next time. Right. And then, I feel like eventually it gets off the ground. I feel like, maybe this Texas football program will never be the Wright brothers, and maybe the damn thing never gets off the ground. But I feel like they've been on the cusp, and that they're not is what I think is so frustrating. This is, when Herman took over from Charlie Strong, the team was just getting his head kicked in.
Right.
So Herman changes the program for the better, in that they stop getting blown out in games. And then suddenly it's, well, they're not winning one possession games. And even a year ago, all the games they lost were within a touchdown. You look at this team again, other than the Arkansas anomaly at this point, all of the other games have been really close.
Yeah.
And, it's the really fine margins that decide whether you win or lose some of these games. And Texas is close in these games and they're not getting over the hump. And then when they're not getting over the hump, everybody's turning their attention to the worst elements of the program and they're beating it with a stick. But I don't think it's a want-to entitlement issue, although I could see where people from afar, I think nationally, people probably do look at Texas in that capacity.
But even if it's not entitlement, I guess the point of bringing it up was, is there still something below the surface here that sort of, puts a governor on this thing? Like what, even if it's evolved, like what is, in your opinion, and maybe it's false, it's a false narrative, but like, what is the, far-reaching indictment for why this program is where it is? Like, how is it that Baylor can be where they were under Art Briles, hire Matt Rule, and then 2 years later be competing for a Big 12 championship, lose him, bring in Dave Aranda, win 2 games, and now be back in the Big 12 title picture again? How is it the program like Baylor can do that, but Texas can't seem to get back in that, Big 12 title picture consistently enough?
I think that there's an interesting conversation to be had about Aranda, because I'm going to point, when I point to, for instance, let's just start here. I think the Texas defense legitimately is 2 badass players away from being really good. If you had Terrell Bernard from Baylor lining up next to DeMarvion Overshown.
Yeah.
And then let's say Joseph Osai comes back for his senior season. So now you've got 2 playmaking linebackers behind what's a solid defensive line at worst. I mean, they eat up blockers. They control the line of scrimmage. They're not making plays. But if you had another playmaking linebacker and Joseph Osai coming off the edge, I think it changes everything about this defense. Now, Aranda, Terrell Bernard was nobody's definitive. He's no 5-star prospect.
Right.
Good prospect.
Right.
I mean, I certainly know who he is as a college prospect, top 100 kind of a guy, but a guy that pans out at the level that he's going to pan out 10% of the time, 15% best. So Aranda on the defensive side of the ball for Texas, his specialty is such that, maybe if he's the Texas coach, he's able to develop and foster that side of the ball better than Tom Herman and Steve Sarkisian as offensive coaches who combined have had 3 different defensive coordinators in the last 3 years, including this season. Right. So one of the things about the defensive side of the ball is that you've had different defensive coordinators for 3 straight years who their visions of what they want in recruiting all differ.
Yep.
So it does lend to creating a bit of a hodgepodge roster that, if with what Pete Kwiatkowski wants to do defensively, it's just quite possible that A, they don't quite have the talent that he would prefer, and B, he hasn't been able to develop what is actually on the roster in a way to kind of fill the gaps until it happens. You look at the offensive side of the ball, it really is about an offensive line that you can go. I made this comment on Orange Bloods today. Texas has had offensive line issues since the 2005 recruiting class. So in 2005, Texas probably had the best offensive line it's ever had. I mean, Lyle Sinline and Jonathan Scott and Casey Studdard and Tony Hill's in the background. I mean, this was an offensive line that was full of All-Americans and full of pros. But in recruiting that year, they had a new offensive line coach come in Mac McWhorter, who changed the personality and profile of the recruits that Texas was looking for. Instead of these big, massive guys, that year they went after Charlie Tanner, who weighed 250 pounds as a high school senior, and Chris Hall, who was an undersized. Those are the only 2 offensive linemen they signed in that class.
Wow.
Beginning with that recruiting class, which was the foundation of the 2009 national championship competing team, but its weakness was on the offensive line. right? We remember Ndamukong Suh doing to Texas in the Big 12 championship game, what he did. And obviously we remember that Alabama definitively controlled the line of scrimmage in that national championship game. Well, that area goes all the way back to decisions that were made in 2005. It's 2021, and there has been an offensive line development / recruitment / identification of prospects that's literally been a problem for 16 years.
Yeah, I mean, think about all those pros that came out of Texas for a long time, and think about now. Well, like, what pros came out of Texas along the offensive line specifically? Connor Williams?
For Texas, you're talking Sam Cosmi and Connor Williams, basically.
Yeah.
You could go back to David Snow, who was an undrafted rookie free agent who stuck with the Bills for a couple of years at the very beginning of the last decade. But other than that, that's been kind of it. So Texas has not recruited well, but they've not developed well. Because the thing is, if you take four four-star offensive linemen, the generic math on that is you'll hit on one of those. And if you did that in every class, you've got 5 NFL guys. You know what I mean? Like you stack them on top of each other. And the goal is to develop beyond the national averages. So if you sign 4 four-star offensive linemen, the national average says you'll create an NFL player out of one of those guys. If you hit 2, this is how the margins for good to very good to great to elite start to happen. Well, and Texas, from a developmental standpoint, just to finish this thought, have not recruited and developed highly ranked offensive linemen. They've been well below the national averages in terms of development. So it's a combination of things, obviously, but development's probably the single biggest issue because they're recruiting better prospects than Baylor or TCU or Oklahoma State, but they're producing less quality players than those schools are. And that points to a developmental system that has crossed over 3 different head coaches going into Sarkisian's reign, where that part of the program has fallen very, very short.
Yeah, I think that's, and going back to a video you guys, I think it was your Overreaction Monday video with Anwar, where you guys are going through, auditing the 2018 class, the 2019 class, and you go over the 2018 class is pretty good. The 2019 class is not. And so I think you're right insofar as like the 19 class had a lot of good pieces. I'm trying to remember in terms of the rankings of it, but it just, I think the single biggest flaw of Tom Herman's tenure at Texas was development.
Yeah.
And so as we sort of now audit Sark in year 1 and what we can and cannot, put on his plate, certainly the decision to go for it on 4th and 11 and run a zone, a read option play, that's on Sark. That's just dumb. But in terms of the development of players, like their 2 best offensive weapons, Bijan Robinson and Xavier Worthy. Worthy is a true freshman. Like that's a problem when your 2 best players on offense. One of them obviously is Bijan, which we knew, but Xavier Worthy, that shouldn't be where you are if you're Texas, considering the level of talent you've recruited. Defensively, it's the same kind of thing where it's like, well, Alfred Collins starting to develop, and the DeMarvion Overshown can play. But like when I look at this team, it's like they just don't have they're not as good as we expect them to be this year because there's not much talent there. Some of these players that we expected to be as good as they should be to propel this team to being good, they're not good. And so Sark comes in here and it's like, these are guys that were 4-star and 5-star players that he's inheriting that are years of missed development. So how do you fix that? Because that probably carried over from Charlie Strong too. When you look at Jordan Hicks, to me, is a good example of this. And Hicks, I think, was recruited by Mac, if I'm not mistaken. Jordan Hicks did nothing at Texas that made you think he'd be a pro player, other than the fact that he was a 5-star.
He had an All-American level senior season. So, I mean, he really was. He, in his 1 year under Charlie, just Jordan Hicks, sorry to sidetrack us here, but Jordan was a guy that recruited by Mac.
Right.
And kind of just pretty good. Then he had a really good season under Charlie and then went pro and was like a 3rd round draft pick, but
it shows you the development at the NFL level versus like there are Texas players that are being developed better and they're having better careers because of it. And so I guess like the development thing does go back. And I think
Ari, the thing that Texas weirdly has done a lot of in recent years, too many players in the last decade go undrafted out of Texas and then make the league and end up having really good careers.
Yep.
And you're like, well, why is that guy, Malcolm Brown, the running back, 5-star running back out of Texas, signs with Texas, has he finishes at the time, was the 8th all-time leading rusher at Texas, a school that's had some good running backs. So his career wasn't bad, but doesn't get drafted, and everybody thinks of him as a disappointment. And he's still collecting paychecks and going to earn an NFL pension. And multiple NFL teams have been like, no, that guy's worth having on our team and actually playing. And there's a lot of guys that fit that bill, guys that weren't drafted. And it's been because one of the problems when you look back at Texas is developing NFL players, too many of them have fit that profile.
Yep.
They come in with big rankings. They get drafted in the 6th or 7th round or don't get drafted at all. But once they get to the NFL, they're pulling something extra out of these talents that you wouldn't have guessed would have otherwise been there. And Texas has got to, even Caden Stearns is a weird example.
Yep.
That guy was just okay at Texas, but 5-star talent. He's starting in the NFL as a rookie and playing very well. And yet nobody that would have watched him a year ago at Texas would have thought, oh, well, this guy will be starting in the NFL next year and will be a plus player and a guy that an NFL team will want to partly build its defense around. I mean, it's so complicated in the sense that it's difficult to wrap your head around that. You end up in this situation. It's not just one thing. It's a bunch of little bitty things and you add them up together. It's your 5-star guys, just like BJ Foster. According to Alex's defensive rankings, BJ Foster has been the 2nd most productive player on the defense this year. Borderline 5-star prospects coming out. But nobody that watches him believes that he's a serious difference maker.
Right.
But he's pretty good. And he's a 6'2" safety that can run, that will have started 30 major college games in his career when he leaves, and he'll get a chance to be on an NFL roster. And it may very well be that this time next year, we're like, hey, BJ Foster's playing in the NFL. And I see him on special teams and he's with the Ravens. I mean, we'll see something like that. And we'll look back and we'll go, well, you can't completely call his career a failure, right? But even if he makes the NFL, you can't completely call his career a success because there are limitations to just how successful he was as a college player. And it feels like almost every player that's come through Texas for the last decade has hit their head on the just how good were you in college question of this equation.
So to wrap a bow around this conversation then, to what degree can you assign responsibility for Sark here? What can we evaluate?
Because think about it like this. You give Sark, here's what ends up happening. You end up giving him credit for all of the successes. Similarly, when Jordan Hicks plays a year under Charlie Strong and blows up, you're like, Charlie Strong did it. And yet you don't point at Tyrone Swoops having to play as a first-year guy at quarterback. And you don't blame that all on Charlie. Like, that's Mac's fault, right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
I think you'll look at this team and you'll look at the areas where they were good and you'll say, Sark came in and like that part was good. And I think that there's a real hesitancy to point a finger at a head coach in year one for the things he doesn't get right. So defense wasn't good a year ago. It's not going to be good this year. And it's going to be, well, where was the pass? You're going to make these excuses that in a couple of years, they still may not be fixed. And we may change our mind about the way that we thought we evaluated Sarkisian as a first-year coach. I think right now you'll find that most people are very scared, because I'm having it this week. Texas fans so badly want to believe that Sarkisian is the guy that if you're too overly critical, what you're really saying is that he's not the guy. That
right.
If he came in year one and messed it all up, then it makes your vision for the future hard to achieve. So what ends up happening is, and this happened with Charlie and Tom too, you give them all the credit for the good things they do, and you say Rome wasn't built in a day, and look at all of the challenges that he had to take on, and he just couldn't fix everything in the first year. There's so much truth in reality in that statement. It's not right that we make it a blanket statement, but there's just enough truth in all of that, that depending on where you want to be on the blame game, you can make it work. If you so desperately have to believe that none of this is Sark's fault, that he's doing the best he can and that he's going to be a championship coach, you can process like, look how good the offense has been. It's one of the best in the country, but the offensive line, he didn't create that. And, you know,
right.
If you and I say, but he could have gone to the portal like Baylor did. Shush. Like, you know, everybody comes from a different place.
Yeah.
I think Sark's doing an okay job in year one. Certainly not significantly better than that, because they're 4-4 on the field, but recruiting is certainly higher. It's certainly elevated from where it would have been had Tom Herman stayed around. So the totality of what he's doing, I think probably is a passing grade when you add it all up, but I don't know that I can give him a B. I can't give him an A. That's impossible. So again, there's this gray area, and it really just depends on where your brain allows itself and how it processes information. And I sound overly critical to a lot of people, and yet I'm admitting that there's a lot of stuff that might not even be his fault, right? But to some people, that's not good enough. And it just makes all this very tricky in the first year of a new coach to have a legitimate conversation. If Sark is 7-1 and they've got a top 5 class, it's an easy question to answer. But that's not what this is. And it wasn't that way under Herman, and it wasn't that way under Charlie. You didn't have these magical first years. So this is the third straight coaching change where in year one, right, it's really tough to call, like, what the hell is all of this actually worth? Beauty will be in the eye of the beholder. And obviously years 2 and 3 will write the Steve Sarkisian story in a much deeper level than year one can allow for it to. But, you know, I think that ask 10 people and you're going to get 10 different answers.
That's Geoff Ketchum. I'm Ari Temkin. Make sure to hit that like button if you're still watching this video, which means you like the video.
How do you evaluate? I want to know in the comments section. How do you guys evaluate?
Yeah, good point.
What we just talked about, what grades through 8 games do you give Steve Sarkisian as a head coach? I don't always read the comments, partially because we do like 100 videos. So I can't read all the comments for every video. I will be in the comments section of this video though, because I'm really interested. Like, the variety of perceptions on this is fascinating to me.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a C, but if he pulls a top 5 recruiting class at the early signing period, it has to be like, that's part of it too. It's what happens on the field, but most importantly, he's had to when he came in here, he leveraged Alabama's success to recruiting. You get a guy like Xavier Worthy. Now you've got to leverage that success for more top of line recruiting. So
if they went out and win their bowl game and go 9-4 and have a top 5 class, now we're talking about a higher grade. Yeah. Even if they don't beat Oklahoma, even if you include this 3-game losing streak and the loss to Arkansas, it's all very fluid. But, you know, there are pathways, and consequently, there's a pathway to a D.
All right. Give us your evaluation of Sark year one in the comments below. Make sure to hit that thumbs up, the like button, and subscribe to the channel. That way you're always in the know with everything going on with Texas athletics Texas football, Texas basketball, and beyond. See you later, Geoff. Later.
Take care.